talking about one of my dissertation chapters looking at species interactions in the subalpine flowering community. And as an ecologist, I'm really interested in what are the factors maintaining biodiversity. So in this photo, this was taken out at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab where I've been conducting some of my research. You can see that there are a lot of different flowering plant species here. And I'm interested in the mechanisms maintaining that biodiversity. And with future climate change, we might expect that mechanisms maintaining biodiversity may change. So there are two different ways that climate may affect coexistence. One of those is through direct effects. So for instance, with increasing drought, we might expect reduced survival in some species. And then through indirect effects. So because species are all responding to the same environmental cues differently, they may be interacting with one another in new ways. And at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, there's a long-term data set that shows flowering time is shifting across the community. So on the x-axis, I'm showing day of the year, and on the y-axis, this is mean number of flowers. And you can see that flowers in the blue dots represent data from 1974 to 1983, and then the red dots are more contemporary flowering times. And we're seeing an overall shift in the community. But as I mentioned, species are responding differently, and this is extremely species specific. So I'm going to dive right into my study system. I'm working with two of the really early flowering species in this community. One of them is called Claytonia lanceolata. It's one of the first flowers to come out after spring snowmelt. And this is year on the x-axis and date of first flowering on the y. And we're seeing we're seeing flowering earlier in the season since this data set started to be collected. And as I mentioned, this species starts to come out as soon as the snow is melting, so you can still see snow around it. And then Mertensia fusiformis and brevistyla are two bluebell species I'm also looking at. They again flower as soon as snow melts, and their flowering time is happening earlier over time. And I'm showing date of first flowering, but it's also important to know that peak flowering and end flowering date are also shifting, although not in the same magnitude. So we might expect differences in overlap. So here's another picture. You can see Mertensia coming out of the ground as snow is melting, and there's actually some Claytonia right around it. And as I mentioned, these two species are growing and flowering at the same time, and they often flower right next to each other. So we have a Claytonia and a Mertensia right there. And from that long-term phenology data set, we're actually finding that these two species are now overlapping more in time. So I'm going to show you floral overlap. That's how, this is the orange flower Claytonia and the Mertensia, the blue flower. These are their flowering periods. Low values indicate low overlap, high values indicate higher overlap. And we're seeing that these two species are starting to flower more over time. And I have data to suggest that growth is correlated to flowering time, so we might expect that their vegetative periods are overlapping more as well. And one of my first years of fieldwork, I collected demographic data, and I found that these two species actually show some signs of facilitation with one another. So I ran an integral projection model, and I've plotted population growth rate in Claytonia as a function of Claytonia crowding coefficient, so a conspecific crowding coefficient, and Mertensia crowding coefficient. And I actually found that under higher levels of Mertensia crowding, we're seeing higher population growth rates. So this got me thinking of, are these species facilitating one another for pollinators or for soil and light resources? So the first question I'm going to ask are, do Claytonia and Mertensia facilitate one another for pollinator visits? And there's data collected by the Irwin Lab at the field station suggesting that these two species actually do share pollinators. So I have Claytonia lanceolata and Mertensia, and the colors just indicate the number of times that these insects were found on those flowers. And they found that these solitary bees do visit both of the species, and I've also seen queen bumblebees visiting both species. And I did a few years of observational pollinator observations, and I found that visitation rate does depend on the other species' presence. So this is visitation rate to Claytonia, and I've controlled for different environmental factors and plotted the LS means. So these are visits to Claytonia, and when Mertensia is present, we're actually seeing a decrease in visitation rate. So this is a little bit opposite of what I found with the population growth model. And then when I look at the opposite, so this is visits to Mertensia, when Claytonia is present, we're seeing a slight increase in visitation rate, but it's not statistically different. Now, observational data is great, but there could be a lot of confounding factors. So I did an experiment to get at this a little bit more, and I asked if visitation rate to Claytonia depends on the presence of Mertensia. So I started with control plots of Claytonia, and I watched pollinator visitation rate. And then I added Mertensia from other locations into these plots, and again, watched pollinator visits. And I did the reverse. So I also started at sites where I had both Claytonia and Mertensia present, and I removed Mertensia from these plots. And after many observation and hours, it seems that visitation rate to Claytonia is actually not affected by the presence of Mertensia, at least at the scale that I was manipulating these plants. So when I compare control plots to plots where I've added Mertensia, we're not seeing a difference in visitation rate. And when I do the opposite experiment, removing Mertensia, again, I'm not really seeing a strong difference. And I'm going to get back to this experiment at the end. So just to wrap up this, it doesn't seem like they're actually facilitating one another for visits, in number of visits at least. So because these two species are growing so close to one another, I thought, okay, maybe if they're not interacting for pollinators, they might be interacting for shared soil and light resources. So to get at this question, I designed an experiment where in 2016, I marked a number of focal Mertensia and Claytonia individuals. So this blue flower in the middle is a Mertensia. And then I did a series of removals where I'm showing you here where I removed all of the neighbors, but I also did a combination of removing Mertensia and Claytonia to see if they were directly competing with each other. And then I returned to these sites in 2017 and I collected survival size, flower number, and fruit number. And I actually didn't see any difference in my removals for most of these metrics except for survival. So I'm going to show you one slide. And I found that neighbors actually slightly increased the survival of Mertensia. And this is not just Claytonia neighbors. I didn't see any effect of Claytonia on Mertensia. But when I plot probability of survival, when I remove neighbors, we actually see that survival goes down a slight amount. So this got me thinking that perhaps the neighbors are facilitating Mertensia for water. So when I did the removal, I noticed that the area around my focal plant was really dry. I didn't have any qualitative or quantitative evidence of this, but when I returned in 2018, I did a watering experiment where I supplemental watered half of my plots. I increased water to twice the historical average in this area. And I again went back to these focal individuals and collected survival size and flowers and fruits. And I actually found no effect of neighbors on survival, even with the watering as well. So I'm again plotting probability of survival, and this is control where I didn't add water. So we do see a little bit of a decrease in survival when I remove neighbors, but it's not statistically significant. And when I add water, we do see an increase in survival. Again, this is not statistically significant. Okay, so do Claytonia and Mertensia facilitate one another for these soil and light resources? And the answer is not at the scale that I was looking at, or no in this case. So overall, I'm showing you that there's really no evidence of competition or facilitation for pollinator visits. I didn't tell you this, but when I did the pollinator experiment, I also looked at floral constancy, and I never once during the whole experiment saw a pollinator go from a Claytonia to a Mertensia flower. So I actually, even though the same pollinators may visit each other, they may be constant in a specific foraging bout and delivering high percentages of conspecific pollen. I also found that there's no effect of neighbors on growth and reproduction, although there was some evidence of an effect of survival in 1 year. So this may translate into larger effects. These are long-lived perennials, and maybe a slight increase in survival may affect population growth rate, but it was pretty weak during my experimental years. And so to bring it back to kind of the theme of this symposium, the experimental scale that I asked the pollinator visitation rate, it doesn't match pollinator foraging distance. So pollinators may forage up to 3 kilometers, and I was manipulating flower density at 2 by 2 meter plot levels. So thinking about experimental design in the future. And I did see the slight positive effect of neighbors on survival may have some small consequences for population growth rates. So right now I'm taking these data and building in a demographic model to ask this question. And it's interesting, so I spent a few years trying to understand how two species that are growing close to one another, who I thought may be competing for resources or facilitating one another for resources, it's pretty complex when we start to think about multiple shared resources between species. So just to bring it back to the beginning, so in a really small community, 3 flowers, under future climate change, we're finding that some species may overlap more in time, some species may overlap less, and there may be no change in overlap at all. And at the community I'm working at, this analysis has been done, and we can see that there are many, many species, and their overlaps are changing in many different directions. And my study was only looking at one of these boxes. So it's something to consider as we're starting to think about how climate change affects coexistence of species, how it's affecting these smaller interactions. And with that, you can ask me questions at the coffee break. Thank you.